Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day. So join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. The golden rule in our house was simple: if Sarah wanted it, Sarah got it, and I was just the shadow that lived in the hallway of a suburban home in Ohio, where the air always smelled like my mother's expensive lavender candles and the suffocating weight of being the invisible daughter, while my sister was the sun around which my parents rotated their entire lives. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my hands trembling over a report card filled with straight A's, while my father didn't even look up from his coffee because Sarah had just announced she made the cheerleading squad, and suddenly my academic achievements were nothing more than background noise to the celebration of her social status. They didn't just ignore me, they systematically erased my presence from the family history by taking down my childhood photos to make room for her trophies and her pageant ribbons, until I felt like a ghost haunting a house that was supposed to be my home. And the betrayal wasn't a single event but 1,000 tiny cuts, like the time they forgot my 17th birthday because Sarah had a minor cold, or the way they spent my college fund on her third European vacation because they said she needed to find herself while I was told to figure it out on my own. If I was really as smart as I claimed to be, the pain was a cold, sharp thing that lived under my ribs, and I realized that the people who were supposed to love me most were actually my primary antagonists, who saw my quiet ambition as a threat to their favorite child's spotlight. They whispered behind my back about how I was difficult and cold, never realizing that they were the ones who froze my heart with their indifference and their blatant injustice when they handed over the keys to a brand new car to Sarah for just passing her classes, while I rode the bus to 3 different part-time jobs just to afford my textbooks for community college, because they refused to sign the financial aid papers, claiming it was too much paperwork for them to handle, while they spent hours planning Sarah's grand debutante ball. The night I realized I was truly alone was the night I found them laughing in the living room, and my mother said it was a shame I wasn't more like my sister, because then maybe they would enjoy having me around, and my father just nodded in agreement, while I stood in the dark hallway listening to the sound of my own heart breaking into a million jagged pieces that I promised right then and there I would use to build a fortress they could never penetrate. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I went to my room and started a spreadsheet of every cent I owed and every goal I needed to hit to disappear, because I knew that the only way to win was to stop playing their game and start my own in complete silence, where they couldn't sabotage my progress or drain my energy with their constant demands for me to be less so Sarah could feel like more. I started working night shifts at a warehouse where the work was grueling and the air was thick with dust, but every dollar I earned felt like a brick in the wall of my future independence. While they thought I was just being moody and reclusive in my room, I was actually teaching myself how to code and how to invest the tiny bits of money I managed to save away from their prying eyes and their constant suggestions that I should give my savings to Sarah because she needed a new wardrobe for her social life. I watched them shower her with praise for doing absolutely nothing, while I became a ghost in their house, a silent observer of their dysfunction and their cruelty, waiting for the moment I could finally step out of the shadows and leave them all behind in the dust of the relative poverty they were creating for themselves by overspending on a daughter who had no substance, while ignoring the one who was becoming a powerhouse of quiet resolve and burning ambition, fueled by the very rejection they thought would break me, but instead it made me unbreakable, like tempered steel forged in the fire of their betrayal and their absolute lack of empathy for the child they decided wasn't worth their time or their love. The basement of our house became my sanctuary and my laboratory, while the rest of the family celebrated Sarah's mediocre milestones with expensive dinners and loud parties that I was never truly invited to attend. I spent my nights bathed in the blue light of a second-hand laptop, writing lines of code that felt like digital prayers for a life I hadn't yet earned. My father would walk past my door and mock the clicking of the keys, calling me a nerd who would never understand the real world, while he signed another check for Sarah's mounting credit card debt. And my mother would sigh about how my pale skin and tired eyes were an embarrassment to the family aesthetic when they had guests over for brunch. I remember the exact moment the shift happened deep inside my soul, when Sarah came into my room without knocking and took my last $50 from my dresser, claiming she needed it for a manicure because mom and dad were tapped out for the week and she deserved to look her best for a date with a boy from a wealthy family. She laughed when I asked for it back, telling me that since I never went anywhere I didn't need the money anyway. And that night I didn't argue, I didn't scream, and I didn't go to my parents for justice, because I knew justice was a foreign concept in that house. Instead, I sat in the dark and realized that my silence was my greatest weapon, because as long as they thought I was a failure and a loser, they wouldn't look closely enough to see that I had just landed my first freelance contract with a tech startup in California that was paying me more in a month than my father made in 3 months at his mid-level office job. I started living a double life where I would eat their scraps and endure their insults during the day while building an empire during the hours when the world was asleep, and they were dreaming of Sarah's non-existent future. As a socialite, I learned to mask my expressions and keep my voice flat so they couldn't see the fire burning in my eyes or the way I was calculating their downfall every time they belittled me in front of their friends for being the daughter who stayed in her room while Sarah was the life of the party. The injustice was a constant companion like a shadow that never left my side, especially when I watched them sell my grandfather's antique watch to pay for Sarah's vanity project, a boutique that failed within 3 months because she didn't understand the first thing about hard work or sacrifice. They told me it was family property, and they could do what they wanted with it, never mind that it was promised to me in his will, which they had conveniently ignored because they knew I was too young and too broke to fight them legally. At the time, I recorded every insult and every theft of my peace in a journal that became my fuel for the long nights when my eyes burned and my back ached from sitting on a broken chair while Sarah slept in a designer bed in the room next door that they had redecorated 3 times in 4 years. I started investing my earnings into cryptocurrency and tech stocks during a market dip. And while they were complaining about the rising cost of living and the debt they were drowning in to keep up appearances, I was watching my portfolio grow into numbers that felt like a ticket to another galaxy. I remember one specific dinner where my mother looked at me with genuine pity and asked what I planned to do with my life since I was already 21 and hadn't even finished a traditional degree like the one Sarah dropped out of twice, and I just looked at her and said, "I'm just trying to get by, Mom," while secretly I had just hit my first 6-figure milestone in liquid assets and was already scouted by a venture capital firm for a lead developer role. The irony was delicious and bitter at the same time because the people who shared my DNA were the only ones in the world who didn't believe in me, while strangers across the country were calling me a prodigy and a visionary. I started moving my things out of the house, one small box at a time, disguised as trash or old clothes I was donating, while I was actually setting up a luxury apartment in the city under a corporate name they would never recognize. I watched my sister get engaged to a man who was just as shallow as she was, and my parents promised to throw them a wedding they couldn't afford, taking out a second mortgage on the house that was supposed to be our family legacy just to impress people who didn't even like them, while I sat there nodding and smiling through the pain of knowing they were willing to bankrupt their future for a lie. While they wouldn't even give me $100 for a car repair a year earlier, I realized then that their betrayal was absolute and that they didn't just love Sarah more, they actively disliked the version of me they had created in their heads to make themselves feel superior. My motivation wasn't just about the money or the fame, it was about the moment of revelation when the curtain would finally fall, and they would see that the daughter they discarded was the only one who actually had the strength to survive the storm they were brewing for themselves. I felt like an architect building a skyscraper in the middle of a desert, and every insult they hurled at me was just another bucket of water to cool the hot bricks of my ambition. I stopped feeling the sting of their words and started hearing them as white noise, like the hum of an air conditioner that you eventually forget is even there because I was already living in a future where their opinions carried the weight of a feather in a hurricane. I began to cultivate a network of powerful mentors who saw my worth and treated me with the respect my own father never granted me, and I learned that family isn't about blood but about who stands by you when you have nothing to offer but your potential and your word. My sister Sarah started getting suspicious of my long absences and the fact that I no longer reacted to her provocations, but she was too self-absorbed to realize that the mouse she had been tormenting for years had grown claws and wings and was preparing to fly far above the reach of her petty cruelty. I remember the day I received the keys to my new office space, and I stood in the empty room looking out at the skyline of a city that didn't know my name yet, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a small child. Before I realized I was the unwanted one, the pain was still there, but it was being converted into a cold hard efficiency that allowed me to work 20 hours a day without breaking, because I knew the finish line was finally in sight, and the revenge wouldn't be loud or violent, but it would be total, and it would be permanent, because I was going to own the very ground they walked on without them ever knowing. I was the landlord of their lives until it was too late for them to change the locks or the narrative of my failure. The day of Sarah's grand wedding arrived like a funeral for my parents' finances, and I watched from the sidelines as they spent $40,000 on flowers and champagne that nobody would remember a week later, while the bank was sending final notices to the mailbox that I was the only one checking anymore. They looked at me and my simple off the rack dress and whispered about how I was bringing down the quality of the photos while I stood there with a smartphone in my pocket that held the digital keys to the private equity firm that had just purchased their mortgage from the secondary market as part of my first major real estate play. I didn't feel a shred of guilt when I saw my father puff out his chest and brag to his friends about his successful daughters while failing to mention that he hadn't spoken more than 5 words to me in a month because I was the invisible daughter, the quiet one, the one who was lucky to have a roof over her head according to him, while I was secretly paying for the private health insurance he didn't even know he had lost when his company downsized him 6 months prior. The silence was becoming a heavy cloak that I wore with pride because every time Sarah insulted my lack of ambition, I was closing a deal that would secure my future for the next 3 generations. I started my own tech consultancy under a pseudonym, and within 8 months we were handling the back-end infrastructure for 3 of the largest retail chains in the Midwest. And the money started flowing in not as a trickle but as a flood that I channeled into diversified assets and offshore accounts because I knew the moment my family smelled a scent of my success they would come crawling with fake smiles and open palms claiming that they always believed in me, and that family sticks together through thick and thin. I watched my mother's face age 10 years in a single afternoon when she finally opened the letters from the bank and realized that the lifestyle they had built for Sarah was a house of cards leaning against a hurricane. She cried in the kitchen while Sarah was upstairs complaining that her honeymoon suite wasn't luxury enough, and my father just sat at the table with his head in his hands looking like a broken man who had finally run out of lies to tell himself. I could have stepped in right then and offered them a lifeline, but I remembered the night they left me in the rain after my high school graduation because Sarah wanted to go to an after-party, and there wasn't room in the car for my bags, and my resentment became the fuel that kept my heart cold and my focus sharp. I began to systematically acquire the debt of the people who had bullied me in high school, and the businesses that had turned me away when I was desperate for work, not out of a desire for destruction but out of a need for total control over my environment so that no one could ever make me feel small again. I moved into a penthouse that overlooked the very park where I used to sit and cry when I was 16, wondering why I wasn't good enough for a birthday cake or a kind word. And I realized that the only person who needed to validate my existence was the woman I saw in the mirror every morning, who had survived the betrayal of the people who were supposed to be her protectors. My sister's marriage began to crumble within 90 days because she didn't know how to exist without a constant stream of her parents' money, and her husband was a predator who had only married her because he thought our family was wealthy beyond measure. When he found out the truth, he left her with a mountain of legal fees and a bruised ego that she tried to heal by coming to my apartment for the first time in years. She stood at my door and looked at the luxury around her with eyes full of greed and confusion, asking how I could afford such a place while the rest of the family was facing eviction. And I didn't even let her pass the foyer. I simply told her that I had worked 3 jobs while she was getting manicures, and that my success was none of her business, before closing the door on her tearful face, which felt like the first real breath of air I had taken in a decade. The injustice of my childhood was being balanced out by the cold reality of the present, and I was the one holding the scales while my parents started calling me 20 times a day, leaving voicemails that transitioned from demands to pleas to desperate prayers for a daughter they had treated like a burden for 20 years. They didn't know I was the one who had bought their house at the foreclosure auction, and that I was the one who was deciding whether or not they would spend the next year in a shelter or in the home they had worked their entire lives for. I spent my days in boardrooms where men twice my age leaned in to hear my opinion, and my nights in the quiet luxury of a life built on the rubble of my past heartbreaks, realizing that revenge isn't about hurting people, but about becoming so successful that their existence no longer has any power over your emotions or your future. I felt a strange sense of peace as I watched their social media posts turn from filtered lies about their perfect lives to cryptic quotes about family loyalty and the importance of supporting one another in hard times, because I knew the masks had finally slipped and the world was seeing them for the hollow shells they truly were, while I was the one with the substance and the strength to carry the world on my shoulders if I chose to. But for the first time in my life, I chose to only carry myself and the few people who had actually seen me when I was invisible. The pain was still a part of me, but it was no longer a wound. It was a scar that reminded me of where I came from, and why I could never go back to being the girl who begged for a crumb of affection from people who were only capable of loving a reflection of their own vanity and greed. The day of the final confrontation arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt heavier than any storm I had ever witnessed, when my parents and Sarah showed up at the glass doors of my corporate headquarters without an appointment, looking like 3 lost souls who had wandered into a world they weren't meant to inhabit. The security guards called me and asked if I wanted them removed, but I told them to send the family up because I wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized the girl they called a failure was the one signing their eviction notices. They walked into my office, and the silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife as my mother clutched her designer handbag, which was now scuffed and worn out, while my father refused to look me in the eye, standing in the presence of the mahogany desk that cost more than his annual salary. Used to be Sarah was the first to speak, her voice high and shrill, demanding to know why I was being so cruel to my own blood, and how I could sit in luxury while they were being forced out of their childhood home. She called me a monster and a traitor to the family name, never once mentioning the years of neglect or the way they had treated me like a stray dog in my own house. I let her talk until she ran out of breath, and then I slowly stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city they thought they owned, and I told them in a voice that was as cold as ice that I didn't owe them a single explanation because they had spent 20 years explaining to me exactly how little I mattered to them. My father finally spoke up, his voice cracking, as he asked if it was true that I was the one who had purchased their debt, and I turned around with a smile that didn't reach my eyes and told him that I was indeed the owner of every single liability they had accumulated, trying to keep Sarah in the lifestyle she hadn't earned. I told them that the house they loved so much was now legally mine, and that I had already signed the paperwork to turn it into a shelter for neglected children because that was the only way to cleanse the property of the memories of my miserable childhood. My mother started to weep, begging for mercy, and reminding me of the time she had tucked me into bed, which was a lie we both knew, because she was always too busy preparing Sarah for pageants. To even know if I was in the house or not, I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of pity for these small people who thought that love was a transaction, and that family was a safety net they could abuse until it snapped. Sarah tried to lunge toward me, calling me a bitter loser, but my assistant stepped in and I just waved her off, telling my sister that the only reason she was still standing in this office was because I allowed it, and that her behavior was exactly why she was currently broke and alone despite all the advantages our parents had stolen from me to give to her. I looked at my father and saw the realization hit him like a physical blow that he had bet on the wrong horse, and that the quiet daughter he had ignored was the only one with the character to actually build something that lasted. The injustice of my life wasn't just about the money they spent on her, but about the potential they tried to kill in me, and I told them that if they wanted to stay in their home they would have to pay me rent just like any other tenant, and that there would be no family discounts and no more lies because the era of their reign was over and my era had begun. In total silence they looked at me like I was a stranger, and I realized that to them I always had been a stranger because they never bothered to learn who I was beyond the shadow of their favorite child. I gave them 10 minutes to leave the building and told them that any further communication would have to go through my legal team because I no longer had the emotional capacity to deal with their drama or their fake apologies that only surfaced once I became their last hope for survival. The pain of the betrayal was still there, bubbling under the surface like lava, but it was being contained by the solid rock of my success and my absolute refusal to be their victim ever again. I watched them walk out of the office through the security cameras, and I saw Sarah screaming at our parents in the lobby, blaming them for not making me like her more so I would be more generous now, while my father just slumped his shoulders and walked toward the exit looking like a man who had finally realized he had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. I spent the rest of the day in meetings making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and realizing that the best revenge isn't just winning, but it is living a life so large and so meaningful that the people who hurt you become nothing more than a footnote in a very long and successful story. I realized that the motivation I had found in their rejection was a gift because it had forced me to rely on nothing but my own intellect and my own grit, which were things that no one could ever take away from me. Unlike the money and the status that they had lost so easily, I felt the weight of the past finally starting to lift off my chest as I realized that I didn't need their love and I didn't need their validation because I had built a kingdom on the very ground where they tried to bury me, and I was still standing while they were the ones begging for a place to hide from the sun. I was no longer the invisible girl in the hallway. I was the light that was blinding them, and it felt like the most honest thing I had ever experienced in my entire life. The months that followed the confrontation were the quietest and most productive of my entire life, as I watched from a distance while my parents and Sarah finally had to face the reality of the world they had ignored for so long. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town because they couldn't afford the rent I was charging for the family home, and they eventually stopped calling me when they realized that my silence wasn't a phase but a permanent boundary I had drawn to protect my soul. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sarah had taken a job at a local diner and was struggling to make ends meet without a safety net, but I didn't feel the joy I thought I would. Instead, I felt a deep sense of closure knowing that the cycle of favoritism had finally been broken by the sheer force of my will. And my success. I invested heavily in scholarships for students who came from broken or neglectful homes, creating a legacy that was based on merit and resilience rather than bloodlines and vanity. Because I wanted to be the person for someone else that no one ever was for me. I remember standing on the balcony of my penthouse a year after the eviction, watching the sunset over the city and realizing that the pain which used to be my constant companion had transformed into a quiet strength that allowed me to lead with empathy but also with an iron fist when necessary. I never went back to that house, not even when they moved out and the keys were returned to me by my property manager. I sold it to a non-profit that helps foster children transition into adulthood, giving them a place to belong, which was something I never truly had in that building. Despite having the same last name as the people inside, I realized that my revenge was complete, not because they were suffering but because they no longer mattered to my day-to-day happiness or my sense of self-worth. I had won everything, not just the money and the power but the absolute freedom to be exactly who I am without the suffocating need for approval from people who were never capable of giving it anyway. I started a foundation in my grandfather's name to honor the only man who ever saw my potential, and I made sure his watch was recovered from the pawn shop where my parents had sold it, and I wear it every day as a reminder that time is the ultimate truth teller, and that justice might be slow, but it is inevitable for those who are willing to work in the shadows while everyone else is chasing the spotlight. I finally found peace in the silence that I had once feared, and I understood that being the invisible child was actually my greatest advantage because it allowed me to build a fortress while they were busy decorating a house of cards. I am no longer defined by the betrayal of my parents or the favoritism of my sister, but by the empire I built with my own two hands and the lives I am able to change now that I have the resources to do so. My story isn't one of tragedy anymore but one of ultimate victory. Because I chose to turn my pain into a roadmap for a future they could never have imagined for me. And as I look at the skyline, I know that the girl who used to cry in the dark hallway would be proud of the woman who now owns the light and the dark and everything in between, because I am the architect of my own destiny, and I have finally won everything on my own terms without ever saying a word to the people who tried to break me. They are just ghosts in a story I have already finished reading, and I am ready for the next chapter where the only voice that matters is my own. And the only love I need is the one I have cultivated for myself through the long nights of struggle and the bright days of my absolute success, and I am finally free.